Hello, everybody, and welcome to Fireside Chat. We have a guest today, Kevin Logan, and he will be talking with Alison, and I may pipe in and say a few things myself. I'm Brian Martinez, the host of the Nerdcast and the Gamergate show. So I guess we'll just go ahead and get right on it. Oh, and by the way, if you guys in the chat have any questions, just put them in there, and we'll try to get to them if we can. Thank you for coming on the show, Mr. Logan. I have a question for you.
Yeah.
What is that your cat, and what is his name or hers?
In the picture.
Yes.
On here. Yeah, actually, well, that's not my cat. That's the mother of my cat, who people may have seen in my videos. Her name's Nut, and she's my dad's cat.
Oh.
Okay.
Yeah.
He looks like a Garfield to me. So.
Yeah, she actually is a dead ringer for Garfield. And incidentally, we're a bit late because my cat wouldn't stop screaming her head off to me about going outside, and unfortunately my husband is mowing the lawn, so I was like, cat, you can't go outside right now because you'll get mowed. Well, you probably won't, but I don't think you'll be happy. Well, okay, so let's get this started. So, Kevin, just give us a rundown on your opinions. Let's start with Gamergate. Just give us some bullet points.
Gamergate. Well, Gamergate, like many things to do with the kind of the manosphere or whatever, the stated goals, the kind of the sort of popular or mainstream people within Gamergate say about ethics in video game journalism and things like that, and the examples they bring up where they've been censored or in some way downed by the video game industry, I'm absolutely on board with. It's the underlying problems that I have with Gamergate, things like the harassment of people they see as opponents, the lack of accountability towards people who have been either fraudulent or in some way sort of underhand within their own movement, and that's the sort of problem I have with it, and that's why the stated goals are fine, but I couldn't ever really see myself being a part of something like Gamergate because of that.
Well, I'd have to point out that sort of sounds like I don't like Gamergate because it's composed of humans. Because that's typical human behavior in almost every group you'll find.
Yeah, but I think there's a higher percentage within Gamergate from what, and again, I can only really go from my own experience of dealing with Gamergate people. There seems to be a much more sort of virulent strain of mob mentality within Gamergate than I've seen within many other online movements.
So just to zero in on the word mob mentality, or the phrase mob mentality, what would you say the symptoms of a mob mentality are?
Well, essentially they do kind of hunting in pack style trolling of people. Whenever I've made videos about Gamergate, even ones which have been relatively I've never made a pro Gamergate one, but even ones that haven't been anti-Gamergate but have just been anti an individual within Gamergate, there seems to be a sort of closing of ranks and a kind of attacking of anything that might be seen as in any way detrimental to Gamergate.
Yeah, well, I'm sort of getting back to that whole idea that Gamergate is bad because it's got humans in it. This is true about any strongly held opinion or political belief. The opposite side will go and argue the issues with you if you state a contrary view. So
yeah,
this doesn't what you're pointing out to me doesn't seem to rise above the level of criticism. Could you be a little more specific by what you mean about a mob mentality and the symptoms? I know you're using yourself as an example, but just
well, obviously I'm a very, very small example of that, because you've got people like the kind of main figures that Gamergate is going to have to think, people like Anita Sarkeesian, Brown, or whoever, who received a hell of a lot more harassment. And I think you can see it in, I mean, you say that seems symptomatic of just criticism, but I think it goes far beyond anything like criticism to the point of being actual harassment. It's fine making videos specifically debunking her stuff, and I think you can, because I don't think it's particularly Anita Sarkeesian, that is, because I don't think she has particularly great analysis of things. But there's a difference between that and just instantly naysaying anything she dares to say, or instantly attacking her for any tiny, minor problem she has with her backstory or whatever, you know.
What I'm getting from you is that this is criticism. I mean, even if somebody comes on one of my videos and says, "You're you don't know anything. And without even, I've had people come on my video or Honey Badger videos and say, you guys were dumped by your girlfriends and that's why you're upset instantly. Like this is their first comment, and if they had listened to one minute of our video, they would have heard that I'm your host, Alison Tiemann. With me today is Karen Strawn, Rachel Edwards, Anna Cherry, Hannah Wallen, etc., etc. They would have known if they had listened to 1 minute that most of us are women. And yet their first comment on our video is, you got dumped by your girlfriends, that's why you hate women. So this sort of knee-jerk response, again, it's common to taking any position, a highly charged political position. I apologize, my cat is screaming in my ear. A highly charged political position, you're going to find people come on and immediately knee-jerk about what you're saying without even having listened to it. That's not harassment. That's typical human behavior when you're in this highly politicized situation. So
yeah, I mean, yeah, there are assholes on all sides. I think everyone can agree on that. And the internet seems to be a breeding ground because of the anonymity.
Yeah, because you can knee-jerk anything you want in an instant. Like that guy who came on and accused us all of being upset because we were dumped by our girlfriends. So I mean, it's plausible, but because most of us are not straight, but it's not. You know that he's thinking that we're all men, and 1 minute, and he would have known better. And we get that all the time, just knee-jerk instantaneously. Come on our channel, they knee-jerk immediately. It's everything we're doing is wrong, and it's obvious that they haven't actually listened to anything we've said. And that's just human nature.
I wouldn't wish to undermine in any way your harassment or anyone's harassment, but my point with Gamergate is that Gamergate ostensibly, although it claims to be about ethics, seems certainly, and I'm not going to ever go at the individuals who are involved in actually practically coming up with trying to change ethics policies within video games and all the rest of it, because there are some great people doing great things, but the mass of people that I've seen seem intent on essentially just being either anti-feminist trolls or anti-Anita trolls or whatever. And for me, I think the trolling and the negativity and the instant hatred towards those figures outweighs the benefits that Gamergate brings, as far as I can say.
Okay, well, I mean, I still want to get into this idea of how we define harassment, because I wouldn't define that as harassment. A guy coming on our channel and saying, you guys are guys, therefore I have to dismiss your view, I don't consider that harassment. That is just criticism, even if it's completely uninformed. To me, harassment doesn't raise to the level of harassment until it's a criminal issue. It's something that's persistent and can be tied to one person or and not a group of people, because then you're having a swarm issue, and there's nobody who's really responsible for the behavior of a whole group of people unless there's an instigator. But
that's a point I think about Gamergate, is because Gamergate has tried to sell itself as just a consumer revolt, and within that, as we're seeing, say, with the Occupy Wall Street people, you get the benefits of having a non-centralized, non-sort of leadership-led movement, and you can get a lot of support behind that because you don't have sort of polarizing figures or people making these huge sort of grandiose statements that can be attacked by the media in that way. But with that comes the fact that you have to put up with the fact that you're going to get a lot of assholes clinging onto that movement, and Gamergate seems absolutely intent on ignoring that problem that exists within its own sort of group of people in the world.
Okay, but I have a video. Like, have you ever followed the saga of the Canadian Association for Equality, who's been putting on lectures throughout Canada on issues of gender that they feel don't get enough attention? And if you haven't,
are you Canadian yourself? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Canadian. I'm part of the Commonwealth.
Yeah, no, I was just wondering aloud there. Sorry, go on. You were saying.
So I am actually, a lot of people are intimately familiar with this because the Canadian Association for Equality has probably done the most to bring specifically men's issues into college campuses, and when they do, they experience unbelievable levels of pushback from their opposition. If you look at the Warren Farrell protest, there were individuals who were in the opposition to that the Warren Farrell lecture, which, if you actually watch it, Warren Farrell is basically the Mr. Rogers of the men's issues movement.
Yes, I'm well aware of his book, The Myth of Male Power or something.
But he's very much inclusive of also women's issues, and how they impact, and there's the dynamic between the two. And what they did, what the protesters did, was actually illegal. They embargoed the doors to his lecture, which is a form of unlawful confinement. And then they were spitting and yelling at anybody who attempted to go in. It was unbelievably horrible to watch.
Yeah.
And that kind of stuff, that is consistent with the kind of problems that CAFE has faced with the opposition to bringing their message to college campuses. And again, CAFE does not identify as a men's rights organization. They're merely interested in those gender issues that they feel aren't being adequately addressed. And then there's one lecture by Janice Fiamengo, and in that lecture,
Sorry, what name is that? Because I'd like to note down names of people and sort of
Janice Fiamengo. We actually spoke with her on Honey Badger Radio. Fiamengo.
No, how are we spelling that? Just
don't ask me to spell. I can't.
Okay.
I'm terrible.
Okay.
But you
I'll
can
try it.
actually, Brian. This is something that you. Yeah. Brian has put it in the window for you.
I added a link to Warren Farrell when they were blocking the doors there, and Janice Fiamengo, who was trying to give a speech, and before she could get started, they started to make a lot of noise in the room, and they forced her out.
You have this tiny little blonde woman
there,
facing down a crowd of people who are banging on their desks and blowing horns and totally drowning out her ability to speak. Now, I would classify those kinds of things as harassment, because they raise to the level of a criminal activity, and not just they're preventing people from talking. It's not just criticism, and even knee-jerk criticism. That's preventing someone of having an opinion. And to me,
I would agree that the silencing of a person doing a speech, or well, it's not quite their free speech because that's a governmental thing, obviously, but their right to have their voice heard. I think that's wrong. But I find it quite interesting that you use the phrase "tiny little blonde woman" in there, because I know one of your main objections, it seems, to feminism has been that it has a propensity to make women view themselves as victims.
Well, I actually believe that in that instance, where you have a small woman facing down a crowd, we can actually legitimately say that that is a situation of intimidation. Because,
yes,
particularly when the crowd in question has removed that kind of moral legitimacy. What's interesting is women can lose their victim cred if they step out of line. And I've remarked upon this as well, that women can be turned into targets by exiting the reservation, so to speak. And Janice Fiamengo has very much exited the reservation, and now she's facing a large crowd that's shouting at her. And I would say in that instance, emphasizing the fact that she's also physically vulnerable is perfectly legitimate. I'm not saying that women can't be vulnerable. I'm saying we have to be careful about how we promote vulnerability and the circumstances in which we say it occurs. And in that instance, I think that it's very legitimate to emphasize her vulnerability.
Well, my point with bringing that up, because that might seem like nitpicking, but I really don't think that it is, because yes, obviously she would be vulnerable in that situation, but even a very big man in that situation facing that is not going to be able to.
I totally agree with you.
So the fact that you emphasise her being a small blonde woman seems to me a sort of double standard, that you're happy to emphasise that when you want to make your opposition look bad, but then you want to play the card of saying, oh, well, feminists make women out to be the victim, when you've just done
point
in a very small way.
No, Kevin, point to you. You're right. I shouldn't have done that.
Okay, well, that's very big of you to concede that point. Thank you. Sorry.
All right, so I take that back. Anyone in that position should feel intimidated and afraid, and you should not emphasize the fact that she's female or small. It's a situation where any human being should have our compassion for dealing with that kind of a situation. But again, the overall point remains: the opposition to CAFE And in a lot of cases, there's a huge overlap between the opposition to cafe and the opposition to Gamergate has engaged in those kinds of tactics. And those are very, very unequivocally harassing tactics to the point of being criminal. And I know
Yes,
personally that I've experienced similar behavior from the opposition to Gamergate. So there you go.
Oh yeah, I'm not saying there's not any reverse. I don't know what the word you would want to describe it as, unthinking criticism or whatever. But I think you've defined it a bit too narrowly there as just being illegal. I think you can do essentially harassment that wouldn't necessarily fall. It might fall under the wording of the law, but I don't think realistically you could get a conviction on it. Like say Twitter harassment. You can harass someone on Twitter, but who's ever convicted of that? You know?
Yeah, well, I know, and I take your meaning. We don't want to necessarily exclude our sense of moral, just keep our sense of morality to what's criminal, because there's behaviors that are also abusive that aren't criminal. However, my overall point is that this harassment is more severe than what you're pointing out. And in my case, I am here talking to you who represents, in a lot of cases, the same sort of sphere that is engaged in this kind of harassment. And I'm not going to say that you are responsible for that, or you should be silenced because of that, or even say that because these people are harassing, have engaged in this kind of harassment, that what you have to say is illegitimate. Because I'm going to take you on what you have to say. I'm going to take
and I wouldn't say for a second that you or any individual within Gamergate is what they have to say is illegitimate at all. No, but I just meant in terms of, you asked me my stance on it, and frankly, the reason I couldn't join is because there's too much of that, as far as I can see. But I wouldn't throw any individual under the bus and say, oh, because they're a Gamergater, instantly they're X, Y, or Z.
Okay, but you do. I assume you do identify as a feminist.
Indeed, yes.
Yeah, but here that we've given you evidence and I know we've sort of dumped it on you, so this is something to take away and just cogitate over. But there is evidence that feminism engages in very high level, like that people who self-identify as feminists engage in criminal levels of harassment in name of their ideology. And in that context, you still identify as a feminist, yet in the context of Gamergate, and you know what, I don't want to argue you into identifying in any way that you don't want to identify. I'm just pointing this out. In the context of Gamergate, we're looking at people, what you said yourself, identified as harassment was people having knee-jerk rejections of other people's opinions, and that's the level of the level of malfeasance here is there's no comparison. And so I mean, and again, we have laid on, we've given you this evidence, and obviously you should have time to look at it and decide for yourself. So I'm not going to...
Well, yeah, but I'm happy to accept that there are people who call themselves feminists who do that sort of thing and would absolutely reject those kind of tactics. But I would suggest that the widespread knee-jerk reaction you see is often from radical feminists, of which I am not one of those numbers at all. In fact, actually, I've spoken out against radical feminism many times. Although I haven't made that many videos, I suppose, but on Twitter and things, I've argued the case with radical feminists in the past. I think mainstream feminism doesn't engage in anywhere near the levels of harassment or silencing tactics that I've seen from Gamergate people.
Well, I actually would disagree with that. First of all, I don't think that these individuals were radical, because if you title radical feminists the kind of feminists who think that men should be reduced to 10% of the population and women like me should be killed, I doubt that the women that were part of that, or the women or men that were part of that protest would identify with that. And they were radical perhaps in their motives, but not in their theories. So,
well, I would argue that you've
not motives, sorry, their actions.
Yeah, I would argue that you've slightly strawmanned a great deal of radical feminism there. I think even within radical feminism, the idea that people like you should be killed would still be seen as a relatively fringe idea or policy or whatever. I don't think that's...
Well, let's be fair then. How would you define radical feminism?
I don't necessarily think it's up to me to define it, but from what I've seen of radical feminists, I've not seen... I've seen things like the swerves in terms of the kind of exclusionary people who are obsessed with navel gazing and internal structures and things like that. But ultimately, I think It's mainly, it is often actually sort of misandrist in many ways, but not to the point where they would advocate for the killing of people or some sort of male-based genocide. Well, it's not genocide, a killing en masse of men or anything like that. I
Well,
think
again,
that's a very extreme position, which I think you've either willingly or
the problem that I'm having
sorry, go
with
on,
your
yeah.
yeah, no, I keep interrupting you, so I apologize. I'm women's planning or whatever. The problem that
No,
I'm having with your definition is that again you're relying upon negative, what I would call negative human behavior, rather than an ideological position. So, what do you think the ideological position of the average radical feminist is?
well, it depends what issue you're talking about specifically.
You can't give a sort of an over. I mean, because there must be an overall view, because you're saying that you are not one. So, what are you opposed to?
Well, I'm opposed often to there is a misandry within radical feminism. There are the extremes you've mentioned, and there is a I don't really know how to describe it really. There's a sort of nastiness of intent. There's an exclusionary element to it, where essentially if there's they do essentially sort of purity tests, where if you don't agree with absolutely everything, they will exclude you and cast you aside. And so it's that sort of action that I would suggest would make someone from just a sort of mainstream feminist into a radical feminist. Ideologically speaking, I think that the goals are pretty much the same, I would suggest.
All right. Okay. So, I mean, there are examples of mainstream feminists doing things that, if we keep it just to harassment, we have in the Elliot and can you give me the name on that, Brian? I'm just blanking on it. It's the recent court case in Canada where a man was essentially being charged with Twitter harassment on Twitter, criminal harassment on Twitter, for merely disagreeing with two feminists.
I'll get that for you. Hold on.
Yeah, thanks. That'd be greatly appreciated. And in their case, they are now facing a charge of criminal conspiracy because it's found out that they were planning to try to get this guy arrested. So, and I don't think that I think they're also not radical feminists in terms of beliefs about radically excluding men. But again, you have that kind of.
Sorry, go on.
You have that kind of approach that what I would call dehumanizing your opposition, and even I see it even happening with moderate feminists. I'm not sure I completely buy into your definition of moderate versus radical feminist, because I'm not sure I completely understand it, but I see that dehumanizing the opposition happening with feminists, even moderate feminists.
So his name is Gregory Allen Elliott.
Yes, Gregory Allen Elliott.
And a graphic designer.
Yeah, and he's recently been charged with criminal harassment for tweets that categorically are criticism, not a disagreement.
I'd need to see what was exactly said in that case.
Yeah. And again, it's pretty hard to have these discussions.
Also,
I sent a link to a story. There are several. That happens to be from Infowars, but you can get it from anywhere.
I was about to say, I don't think I could possibly treat as much as people have attacked me for the sources I've used. I would never ever trust a word that Infowars says about anything. They're fucking crazy.
There are better sources than Infowars. There's the Guardian too, I believe, as well. That might have just been the first one. But yeah, Alex Jones generally not really the best source. I think Brian just pulled the first one he could get.
Although, just to engage in a bit of guilt by association fallacy, he's a very strong anti-feminist himself, just out of interest.
Yeah, well, like you say, there's a difference between radical feminists and moderate feminists, as you term them. There's also a difference between different kinds of.
Absolutely. I was being facetious and cheeky, basically.
Okay, yeah. Fair enough. And I was being overly pedantic. Okay.
No, that's fine. By all means. By all means.
Okay, so where should we go from here? What's next?
Well, I did have one thing to bring up actually myself. If you need something to discuss. A couple of days ago, obviously, you contacted me after the Sargon talk to discuss coming on the
Yeah,
show.
actually, my
And so-
patrons asked if I could talk with you, so here we are.
Oh, really? Oh, well, that's quite nice. And I didn't know. I was aware of the honey badgers, and obviously through the Calgary Expo thing, which I presume the people listening to this probably know that story. And so I looked into the kind of into some of your older videos and some of the honey badger stuff, and it was all very good. It's interesting anyway. But at one point I did want to raise with you about because you've got this thing about women damseling for money.
Oh no,
Yeah?
I know what you're about to say.
No, go on then.
Again, again, the video that I did recording what the experiences that I was having emotionally after the expo had ejected me is, in my mind, again, I believe that it is imperfectly legitimate for women to be in a situation where they are vulnerable and even express that vulnerability. But it's also perfectly legitimate to express criticism, especially when women when people advance the notion that women are overall defined by vulnerability. That doesn't mean that women can't have instances of being vulnerable. But if they define themselves in terms of overall vulnerability, there's a difference there. And I even have this argument with men, that we are presenting men as being victims. No, we're presenting the notion that men can be victims, that men can have instances of vulnerability, not that men are victims exclusively or entirely because they are men. So that's the difference. I'm not going to prevent a woman who experiences a situation where she is being ejected from an event for a belief that she holds and holds very strongly to, and is also being subject to a widespread media campaign that is ruining her reputation in the field that she works in or wants to establish a career in. I'm not going to turn to that woman and say, geez, you shouldn't feel bad about this, because quite obviously she should. But the critical thing here is, if a man was in that situation, would I say the same? And I would. I think everybody should. And
yeah,
but look at the situation with the Twitter harassment of Anita Sarkeesian, Brianna Wu, etc., and Joss Whedon. I mean, he's off Twitter now. He's got harassed off Twitter. But people say because he's a man, he should just suck it up. And men get incredible amounts of harassment on Twitter, and it's the narrative that the same harassment or similar harassment men should suck up, but women can damsel over. That's the problem I have. Not any instance of a woman who's experiencing legitimate persecution being upset about it.
Well, in that situation, I would question your belonging and self-identifying as a men's rights activist then, because largely the men's rights activists wish to enforce those harmful gender stereotypes on the world. They're the ones that constantly come onto my videos and call me a mangina and tell me I need to man up, or that feminists have cut off my bollocks or something, you know?
Yeah, no, and this is good because we finally got to a point where I think we got a disagreement that could be fun. Once again, we have a situation where we have different types of anti-feminist and different types of people approaches to men's rights activism, and as you said, the difference between radical feminism and feminism, moderate feminism, as you're titling it. Now, I would agree that at some point men have to challenge the notion that they cannot display vulnerability, and challenge the notion that they are constantly judging each other for having displayed vulnerability. In this case, I think that that you're right. These guys shouldn't call you mangina. I don't use the term myself, and I really question the use of the term because it is a term that denotes a hierarchy, and that's, I think, part of the problem. Though some people would, in the men's rights argument, would argue that a hierarchy is something that men seek out and desire to have. But
it's not just an element within the men's rights movement. It permeates throughout it seems. And obviously there are people like yourself who would disagree. But you must know it's an absolute widespread attitude within your movement.
But the thing is that my movement...
Wait, do you mind? I want to ask a question because I was talking to someone about what the MRM was, and they had heard of it. There's this strange overlap, and we want to be clear in defining our terms. So there is the manosphere, and then you have like the red pill, like, people who are saying that they are red pilled, right? And basically, it's important to understand what that is. And I don't want to insult your intelligence in case you already know this, but just so that we're clear. What happens when a person is red pilled, and I put that in quotes when I say it because I think it's just like a term that helps us understand what we're discussing, is that they learn that the world doesn't work the way they thought it did in terms of men and women and their relationship to each other, amongst other things, which basically includes all kinds of other stuff, but we're only talking about men and women in this instance. And then what happens is you have men that do, or people that take that new information and they do different things with it. So some of them go off, like what the three main categories would be men's rights activists, pickup artists, and men going their own way. And there is some overlap in those, but by and large, they all have different interests, they have different goals. And one of the things that I find that I run into a lot, especially in the media, when they discuss men's rights activists, they constantly conflate them with the activities, opinions, and attitudes of men going their own way, and especially pickup artists. And these things, while they may have taken root in the similar place, are not the same thing. And it's really important to point that out. Again, I don't want to assume that you do or do not know that, but I'm explaining that just so that we're on the same page, because it can be really easy to end up talking past each other if, let's say, your experiences, because usually PUAs, they're the ones that are creating that hierarchy. They're talking about alphas and betas and zetas and stuff like that.
Well, not zetas, just alpha and betas and omegas, really.
Yeah, and omegas. Generally, MRAs don't care about that stuff, but they do want to. They want to look at things like male suicide and family court systems and all the legal stuff. And the MGTOW just walk away in general. Sometimes they linger and they complain, but in general they just walk away.
And also, there's a huge amount of animosity between the spheres.
Yes, and they fight it amongst each other because of the way that they do it. Because PUAs, they put their value on female attention, essentially, is how they judge themselves. And MRAs don't want to deal with that stuff, and MGTOW even less so. So in general, they squabble. And yeah, there are some guys that are, they may be two or even all three of those things, or at least they want to identify with that. But it is very important to understand that this is, we're looking, the manosphere and MRAs are not, they're not one thing. The MRAs they're basically a product of that. So.
Yeah, well, and I wouldn't even say that they're a product of the manosphere, because men's rights activists existed before the manosphere existed. And look at Warren Farrell. I think he's been doing this since the 90s, and it's way before it's not before the internet, but it's certainly before this aspect of the internet. So, but go ahead, Kevin.
I'm aware of the differences between those things, especially as I've openly called myself a feminist on the internet. It's been pointed out very vigorously that X person calls himself this or calls himself that, and I've learned the whole lexicon, the whole spectrum of the manosphere. But I find often with the MRA there's a slipperiness in the semantics that people will either choose to not identify as MRAs and then go on to express basically the same opinions as MRAs. So in which case, where's the difference there?
Okay, wait. Let's slow down a bit. What are those opinions that you think identify someone as an MRA?
Well, they go through the same talking points. That there can't be a patriarchy because of X, Y, and Z. There's male suicide rates show that clearly it isn't men running the show or whatever. They essentially try and break down two main points. It seems patriarchy and rape culture. Seems to be the main two thrusts of what they're trying to do.
I assume that you believe in both, right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, there's a new thing that we can disagree about, but continue with your point.
Well, I rather that's why I was so in the pre-chat. I said that we would find things to disagree on because I've watched in the last couple of days. I've gone back and watched quite a few of your videos, and we were always going to disagree on many things. So yeah, there are people who choose to not subscribe as MRAs or self-describe as MRAs, but basically are in practice, and also there are a lot of people who will essentially use the no true Scotsman fallacy to avoid any blame being attributed to the MRAs by people who don't identify as such, but still espouse the same talking points. So, although yes, obviously not all the people who call me a mangina are MRAs, there's enough of an overlap for me to think that there's a poisoned core at the heart of the MRAs, which actually betrays men. Frankly, it undermines their cause.
Okay, well let me respond to some of the things that you're saying. First of all, I've noticed that you're using radical feminists instead of really identifying a political position related to radical feminists. You're essentially saying these are feminists who I don't want to have to take responsibility for in identifying as a feminist. So I'm going to put everything that I find conflicting or problematic about feminist behavior or feminist beliefs or beliefs of people who are identify as feminists in the radical feminist camp. And I think that that's the same thing that you're turning around and pointing at us for doing. And I hate to create this kind of barrier, because personally I'd rather discuss ideas and concepts than labels. I think discussing labels is a waste of time. But I am going to point out that I think that's what you're doing. You're saying at the same time you have, is the same time as you have the trash can of radical feminists, and anytime we point out some sort of bad behavior, they go in the trash can of radical feminists, and I'm not like those feminists. And then you're turning around and saying, well, you can't do the same to the people who are problematic in your movement. And it's like, and as much as I want to point that out, that I think you're doing that, and I'm actually perfectly willing to say, yeah, you can say that I don't have to take responsibility for the behavior or the beliefs of crazy people who think that 10%, men should be reduced to 10% and women like me should be killed. That's fine. I don't expect you to take responsibility for that. But at the same time, I don't think it's fair for you to expect me to take responsibility for men or people who I don't even know if they identify as men's rights activists specifically, or as gamergaters specifically, calling you a mangina, which is just an insult. Like, am I supposed to make you take responsibility for every feminist or troll on the internet who calls me a fat slut? Like, this makes the discussion so pointless. Like, let's get beyond making each other take responsibility for crazy people on the internet and get into the meat of the matter, which is what I think the meat of the matter is. And I think you finally identified the crux of the issue. You say that men's rights activists deny patriarchy and rape culture. I think these are your defining characteristics for what a feminist is. That you believe in patriarchy and rape culture. Would you agree?
In essence, that's the starting point, yes. I think so.
Okay,
but
well,
to go back
go
back quickly, a point you made about it's pointless to argue about labels. I don't think that's actually true, because surely the label that someone sticks themselves under and the labels that people try either to stick on someone or to rip off someone or whatever, surely that's a really defining thing about a person, is it not?
I actually despise labels. I only took the label men's rights activist because I was experiencing a situation where there were men. Actually, you know what? I really apologize for this, but it's getting really bad. Kevin, your echo is getting. Is there any way that we could fix that? Do you have headphones?
I muted him just because there's an echo, Kevin. It's not.
It's nothing to do with. It's just I'm having. I'm a little bit attention deficit disorder, and when you add the echo in, I have a real trouble following. But what I was going to say is, now I forgot what I was going to say. Goodness. Brian, help me out here.
We were talking about labels. And
oh, yeah, okay, all right.
Like them.
No, I don't like labels. I took on the label of men's rights activists for a very specific reason, because people cannot, it's stigmatized, essentially. People are not allowed to talk about men's rights as being a subset of human rights. And when there's a point where we can freely talk about men's rights as a subset of human rights, then I'm just going to jettison the label, because I don't like it. I don't like bearing a word on myself. It just feels like a weight. And the moment that I took it up was when the SPLC called, or actually they didn't call a bunch of sites associated with men's rights a hate group. They didn't retract that. They never actually made that assertion. But there were a bunch of people on the biggest men's rights Reddit, or the biggest community of men's rights at the time, the men's rights Reddit, who were expressing suicidal thoughts over this, because this is a community where they had felt support. And and I took on that label because if they're going to blame or stigmatize that group of people, then they can stigmatize me too. And that's why I also adopted Gamergate, because I don't want to see people being silenced using these stigmatizing words. I want them to come to the table and be able to speak. I mean, that's what you want, right? You don't want to encourage the lunatics flame warring each other in comment sections. You want to encourage, the conversation at the top, as it were, where the ideas are. And I think we need to unmute Kevin, because I sense that he probably wants to speak to that.
Oh, I can't unmute him. I can only mute him. But
Kevin,
I want
you can unmute yourself at any point.
You can unmute yourself, Kevin. I apologize. It was just that there was a lot of feedback.
With the feedback, I've put earphones in now, so hopefully the echo should be gone now.
Oh,
okay. Yeah, it looks like it is.
A lot better.
If I start speaking more loudly, it's because I can't hear the level of my own voice now.
Oh,
okay.
I wanted to say something about labels too, really quick. I think that we are in, and it's probably because of the internet, and it's probably because of a number of other things. We're living in a time where our media uses labels to really very easily demonize opponents. We're big on doing, it seems, and I say we as a collective, not like us specifically, is basically othering people who we don't agree with, who belong to groups that we may not like, whatever, and then we use the label, and the label becomes the argument itself, and then people don't discuss the actual issues. If you, for example, if somebody might just say, well, they're conservatives, and that ends the discussion, as though just being one is just bad enough, or when somebody might say, oh, I won't go to Fox News. That's a label. Like whatever they say there can't be true, or whatever they say on MSNBC can't possibly be true. Whatever liberals are doing can't possibly be worth anything. Whatever straight people are doing, whatever white people are doing, these are all useless terms. And this is the place that we've gone, where the Young Turks can put up a show, and they can literally just say, well, this is from these guys are just on the right, or these guys are just Christians, or these guys are just this, and they don't even have to make an argument anymore. And that's ridiculous, because we want to be able to have discussions about ideas and issues and get out of that murkiness, where essentially what people who use labels in this way do is they use the worst examples, or whatever examples are the most beneficial to your argument, to represent the opposing person's argument. And that's not useful, because you don't actually address any issues at all. So, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go on, sorry. All right, well, basically, I think it's interesting you bring up, say, Fox News or the Young Turks as examples, because I think those are basically two ends of or two sides of the same coin, in essence, a left and a right extreme. And they do use terms like conservative or liberal or whatever as shorthand for asshole, basically. But I think in general terms, labels can be very useful if used properly by media sources, because people don't have time to read or listen to hours and hours or pages and pages of political diatribes explaining each and everything. So you need a shorthand way of saying this is what this is, if that makes sense. So actually, used properly, labels are incredibly important in communicating ideas to people.
A shorthand can be useful, but the problem is it's gotten to the point now where the shorthand version represents a very narrow and often fringe example of that side. So if somebody I consider myself a really open-minded person. So if somebody tells me I heard this from a conservative source or a liberal source, I do not automatically assume that they are talking about the Young Turks or Fox News. I want to hear what they have to say, and then based on that, I will basically form my opinions. But not most, I don't know how many, but I think that lots of people, it's gotten to the point where they just hear the label and they stop thinking. And I think that's where you should start thinking. That's
yeah.
No, I will agree with that point completely, yeah.
Okay, so let's get into the discussion of, rather than behaviors and labels, let's discuss ideas. which is where I'm happiest. Okay, so just to get back to the patriarchy and the rape culture, which I believe, first of all, let's clarify this. This is the starting point where you see the dividing line between maybe a non-feminist position and a feminist position. Patriarchy and rape culture. All right.
Yeah.
All right, so my question...
Well, more specifically patriarchy, but rape culture is essentially a part of that. It's almost a subsection of it, really.
Okay, well,
patriarchy
and actually, before we get into that, I did want to address one thing. I will agree that in the men's rights movement, there are still men who buy into toxic aspects. And I don't mean toxic in terms of toxic to women, but toxic to men and other men, themselves and other men. Toxic aspects of the male role. And there's lots of disagreement as well, whether or not this is toxic and if it's functional and so the healing, I recognize that there's a healing that needs to happen within the movement itself. And that there's still buy-in to these kinds of to the male side of the dynamic that needs to be moved past, perhaps, or invited to move past, not forced, but just said, there might be a better way to approach it than this. So I agree that there are damaged people in the men's rights movement, and I agree that there is bad behavior in the men's rights movement. I agree that there is anger, and I don't agree that that is unhealthy. And I would say the same about the feminist movement. But I disagree at looking at the negative, like looking at human behavior and trying to ascribe it to the label. Because we're all humans here. We're all going to act like idiots. That's sort of a human thing, no matter what we believe.
Well, yes, but in that, if you're going to take judging every individual to that, I would argue, slightly silly extent of saying, well, everyone in a movement is an individual, therefore you can't really judge the movement. That, I think, is a gross oversimplification of it, or too broad, I think, anyway, because ultimately, I mean, Godwin's law, you can't look at the Nazi Party and say, oh, they're all individuals. No, they're poison to the core.
No, then we just look at the ideology and not necessarily the behavior of. Well, we can again. We can
look at either the behavior or the ideology.
Well, we can look at the ideology and the behavior, but we're not in this instance. If we want to, we got to look at both sides' behavior, and it's like, yeah, sure, we can do that. But can we talk about the actual ideas behind each side? Like, I mean, we can do both, and it's both is legitimate. But at some point, you got to say this behavior doesn't rise to the level of Nazism. I mean, some guy coming onto my channel and saying you guys were dumped by your girlfriend. I don't think that he's a Nazi.
No, I was using that as an extreme example of you can't just say, oh, they're all individuals. Sometimes a big group like that, you can basically you can ascribe certain negatives to them, even though not necessarily all of them are fulfilled because they're so dangerous and toxic.
Well, yeah, but in that case, you're looking at a situation where they're empowered by certain social, like they have governmental power, they have influence, they're creating widespread propaganda that targets Jewish men in particular as pedophiles and rapists of Aryan women and a threat to Aryan women. I mean, there's certain features of that particular group and the power level of that particular group, and you have to bring that into the discussion. Internet trolls are not creating a North America-wide campaign to portray in like billboards and on posters and in millions and billions of dollars worth of visual stuff on television to portray what you're saying, that their particular biases or bigotry.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, when I was let's not get hung up on the fact that I purposefully broke Godwin's law there, because I was using an extreme example to raise the point. Yes, they're not as big a thing, but ultimately groups like A Voice for Men, for instance, are creating huge amounts of propaganda, and because it's on the internet, anyone can get access to it.
Yeah, but still, it's not like A Voice for Men has an operating budget. Okay, well, okay, all right, let's address this. A Voice for Men has an operating budget of what, maybe $60,000 a year, all through donations.
I couldn't even guess.
That's my guess. When you're looking at at what they say, and I would disagree that is even in the ballpark in some of the feminist stuff that they're putting out, and they get billions of dollars or billions of dollars to paint a particular picture of sexual violence that excludes male victims and emphasizes the malfeasance of all men. And what's interesting that
male victims?
Yes, it does exclude male victims.
I would bring up the Rape is Rape campaign, which got the FBI to change its description of rape.
But I'm talking about widespread visual, like widespread let's comparable to what you're saying the Nazis did. Widespread.
No, let's not get caught up on the Nazis. I was using that as a rhetorical thing to argue against the point.
I'm just trying to say, let's look at the scope here. We have a countrywide, like North America, Europe wide presentation of rape in a certain way. And ironically, it does actually really resemble a lot of the same kind of propaganda that was presented against black men and Jewish men. And there's even a campaign that says "Name the problem" with a male face. And that's huge.
Men
reach.
are a huge problem within rape, are they not?
I don't think that they're the. I do not think that. I do not agree.
Most rape is done by men, is it not?
Okay, here we go. You can't actually say that. There's statistical evidence, and you don't need to have. You just need one counterexample, and there's plenty. So we are finding out now that we're looking into the issue. Yeah. Well, one counterexample would be the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey for North America. In the last 12 months, which is the most accurate estimate of the relative prevalence of rape, men and women haven't answered yes equally to the question, were you forced in the last year to have sex? And there is a high rate of female perpetration in that number. So at this point in time, and this is held true for 2 years on that survey for the last 12 months. Now, the last 5 years.
I haven't seen that, so I'd have to look at it.
You'll have to look at it. Well, let me
if you could link me to that would be.
But the thing is, in this situation, when you find
because the numbers that I've seen would suggest that men are far more likely to be rapists.
Well, but here's the issue. What are these surveys actually capturing? Let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
Do you think men reveal the fact that they're raped by women? Is there a cultural milieu in which men feel free to reveal something like that?
No, but I would argue actually that again is reinforced by parts.
It doesn't matter what. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
It is because essentially, if we're going to argue MRA or men's rights versus feminism,
wait. Let's not bring the labels in. Let's not bring the labels in.
It's
Kevin, Kevin.
Yes.
Let's not bring the labels in. Let's not get off track. You said yes. Therefore, finding out the level of victimization of men by women is going to be very difficult. And now here, what's interesting about what you said and what you admitted to is that if you look at this and you look even at just the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, 2 years in a row, equal numbers of men in the last year have said that they were sexually abused or essentially raped, although they did some statistical chicanery in which when men said yes to "were you forced to have sex," they called it "made to penetrate," and when women said yes to "were you forced to have sex," they called it rape. Regardless, equal numbers of men and women said yes to "were you forced to have sex" in 2 years in a row. Yet at the 5-year mark, when the survey asks men, in the last 5 years, have you been physically forced to have sex? The number of male victims, goes from 50% to 30%. And then when you ask for lifetime, it goes down to 20%. Because men conform their experiences to the dominant narrative. Either that, or because they don't have services, they completely wash out and no longer are available to take these surveys. In other words, they become homeless, they become institutionalized, suicidal, and because they have absolutely nowhere to go with the abuse that they've suffered. So it's much more devastating to them. Now,
okay, then.
That you have to account for that factor, the factor that men reduce, somehow align their experiences with the dominant narrative, which is a phenomenon that memory researchers are aware of, that we all do this. And
Okay.
when men don't feel free to express this or see this, that this is an aggression done to them, it disappears. It disappears, and what we're seeing in the statistics, in other statistics, is not the truth. What we're seeing is an effect of our own social biases. And the fact that we have some statistics that have, for whatever reason, whatever miraculous reason, have actually cut through that social bias for men not to see themselves as victims, and certainly not to see themselves as women, we need to look at that and say, you know what, we don't know what's going on here. And until we figure out what's going on here, we need to stop the nationwide, the Western worldwide propaganda pointing the finger at men, because all that's going to do is perpetuate the same social cycle that makes male victims invisible. And incidentally, as a woman, those enormous propaganda campaigns, billions of dollars being pumped into this, as a woman, when I looked at the statistics and found out what was really going on, or ultimately that we don't even know what's really going on, I felt freedom for the first time in my life, because I wasn't a target. So not only are these propaganda campaigns, and I would call, not only are these so-called rape awareness campaigns being perpetrated based on information that we should be seriously questioning, thus rendering male victims invisible, they're also heaping brick upon brick upon brick of fear and terror onto women that they have to lug around. And I know the feeling of letting it go. And it is wonderful.
How would you ascribe the people who are doing this quote-unquote propaganda?
Sorry, could you explain the question again?
What groups is it that you think are doing this propaganda?
The groups that are doing it.
Yeah. What would you define them as?
Well, I would define them as informed by a particular, because it's not just feminists. It's also, in some cases, Christian groups, in some cases, non-denominate, like just neutral NGOs. It's basically groups of people who are informed by the notion that women are defined by being victims and actually make a lot of money by perpetuating that notion. Because
politicians that are looking
politicians, even conservative politicians do it. So I'm not going to say that feminists are responsible for it, but there is a social force. There's a social attitude.
They're in part to blame for that.
Yeah, I believe that they are in part. But the thing is that they buy into.
Okay.
Yeah, but listen. They buy into a social attitude towards men and women. Feminists buy into a social attitude towards men and women that conservatives buy into, that Christians buy into, that I think even everybody around the world almost buys into. They buy into this attitude. So it's not necessarily that, feminism itself is responsible for the attitude, but it buys into it.
Well, I think it's quite interesting that, having said that I can't get back to the labels, I'm off point. You've mentioned several labels there and bribed a series of propaganda that's hurtful to both men and women to those groups. And I wonder how fair this conversation can be when you're establishing that I can't mention the MRM as being a negative force, but you can then spend what's been about 2 minutes describing precisely why feminists are evil.
Well, I haven't spent 2 minutes describing why feminists are evil. I've just spent 2 minutes describing why a social phenomenon that feminists ascribe to is evil.
Not just feminists, but conservatives and politicians and whoever.
Yeah, and I would say that.
Do you not see the double standard there?
No, I don't, because I would say that any men's rights group or organization who also ascribes to this particular attitude, I don't want to even say evil, I'm just saying counterproductive and hurtful. I mean, it's not evil, it's just human. It's human to want to keep attached to these attitudes that have served us in the past. We get attached to our attitudes. It's perfectly human. It's not evil. It's just something we do, but it's counterproductive now. And we need to move past it.
Exactly. I agree. I think it is counterproductive, and I would argue that it's the men's rights, and not just men's rights, but the manosphere in general, that wishes, at least in terms of social attitudes, to drag us back to an era where, if your statistics are correct, men did not feel comfortable admitting that they had been raped by, like you were saying, going back 10 years, 20 years in their whole lifetime.
Yeah, but like
And
once again, you're going into
I would say that they have
tribalism.
been.
You're saying it's them, not
Well, like I
us.
say,
But it's all of us. It's everybody. Everybody has a part to take responsibility in this, and it's time to move past
yeah, but
pointing
this is getting back
fingers.
to the idea that, oh, we're all individuals. Yes, of course we're all individuals. We all have roles to play. But in that sense, you can't criticise any larger group on the basis of things they do which you think have negative impacts, because there might be some within that group that don't believe.
You certainly can criticize them, but you cannot. Like at the beginning of this, you used people making knee-jerk criticisms of Brianna Wu and Anita Sarkeesian, and I used harassment, criminal harassment. And I'm saying that the groups on, I don't want to say your side, but the groups who ascribe to the feminist label are engaging in kinds of criminal harassment. That's criminal. And then you're looking at the other side that's engaging in criticism on the internet. These are not comparable behaviors, but even then, I'm saying I'm not going to tell you that you need to take responsibility for the criminal harassment engaged in by feminists in another situation.
No,
I don't want to do that.
I'm not asking you to take responsibility for anything, but I'm saying you are willingly associating yourself with
you're
people
willingly
whose
associating
attitudes.
yourself with this. You're willingly associating yourself with groups of people who are creating wide-scale campaigns that may be based on very bad science, that are pointing the fingers at a particular subset of humanity that also faces sexual violence, and is eerily similar to other campaigns in the past that pointed the finger at black men and Jewish men for being implicated as being uniquely sexually violent. So it's like, yeah, we can keep doing the blame game, or we can look at what we do, what I do, what you do, and start correcting that. And I'm going to agree with you if you say that there are problematic aspects of the men's rights movement. Yeah, there are. And a lot of it stems into buying into this dynamic. I'm going to agree with you totally. But I'm not going to agree that we need to start pointing fingers and saying, because that when we do that, when we start pointing fingers, we stop taking responsibility for what we're doing to perpetuate the problem.
I don't think that's necessarily true at all. I think you can happily go about trying to improve your own attitudes and improve your own tactics or whatever you're doing to do it, but also saying, look at this person, like a person I've had a go in the past, Paul Leela. I'm more than happy to attack him whilst accepting that I'm not perfect, because he's incredibly not perfect. Do you know what I mean?
Well, sure. You can attack whomever you want, but you're pointing a finger at an entire movement and saying it's completely illegitimate. Everyone involved in it. It's tribalism.
No. I've not said and would never say they're completely.
You're saying that there's You did say there was a toxic core. There's a toxic core to the men's rights movement, but Paul Elam isn't the core.
But that's not. No, he's not the core. No, but the fact that he's not celebrated as such, but he's quite a well-known, popular figure within that movement. And yes, there is a lot of opposition to him, as people have pointed out. But he's the head of one of the most popular MRA forums or websites or whatever. I think shows to a degree that there is a toxic core, but that's not to write off everything they do or everything they stand for. But I think people like him hide behind those
First of all, I think that a lot of the problems in that is that people are not analyzing what they're seeing. They're knee-jerking what is being written about in that particular area. But I don't really want to get into a analysis of one particular group, because you're saying we all bear the responsibility at the same time as you don't as a feminist. And I'm saying let's set aside trying to point fingers and try to blame and say, hey, you bear all the responsibility for the crazies over there because they chose to assume your name or your label, and you bear all the responsibility for the crazies in your camp, and let's try to resolve what is wrong with just move past the problems that we have collectively. And stop playing the blame game. Stop playing the tribalism game. Start discussing the issues, discussing the questions, and doing it in a rational and calm way.
Okay, but I would argue, I mean, the Honey Badger's last, or was it last show or one before that, you did called, was it White Knights?
Yeah, it's a behavior.
I believe. Yeah, it's a behaviour. Yes.
Yeah,
But you're right.
we could call out behaviors, but the difference is this.
You're playing into the idea there, and I think it's to a degree it's sort of dog whistle politics, that you're playing into the idea that you can't really be a male feminist without being a white knight.
Okay, first of all, we were talking about the behavior. There are more than men who engage in white knights aren't just feminists. White knight behavior is not just feminist. And I want to say we can criticize behavior and we can criticize thought processes and dynamics, but saying that a group of people has to, or like, for example, gamergate has to take responsibility for the fact that they are composed of humans is ridiculous. Or even feminism has to take responsibility for the fact that they're composed of humans is ridiculous. But at the same time, we can criticize the behavior. And we can criticize the theories behind feminism and see how they impact the greater society. Now, I got to get going, Kevin, because I got other stuff I need to do today. But if you wanted to have a final word, go ahead.
No, well, I would have liked to have gotten back to a point earlier, but if we've got to go, we've got to go. That's no problem. Thank you for having me.
You can always come on again. I just have other chores that I got to accomplish today.
That's okay, Kevin.
No, that's
I wanted to say a couple things too, though.
And actually, if you want to engage with Brian, I can drop out.
Well, I got to get going because I got to go to work in a few minutes myself. So it's
yeah, and then at that point in time, the thing is
the clock, the
discussion is completely over because Brian is hosting the call. So
yeah, I guess it's true. I wanted to say that thank you for coming on, and I hope that we can do this again sometime if you want to.
Yeah, sure. It's been great.
Really, I think it's really important to have these conversations because when people have their discussions in their little corner, it can very easily turn into an echo chamber situation, and we want to challenge our ideas constantly so that they become stronger, or you might realize new truths that you didn't know about before, and I'm all about that, but yeah. I wanted to there were a couple of questions or statements in the chat that I wanted to mention. So Alison, if you want to go, that's cool. The other thing I wanted to say is as far as the gender topic in the public sphere, where the stuff that most people see, because to be honest, what happens here, between us, Honey Badger Radio is minuscule. All of these MRA, men's rights, YouTube channels, and various spaces, they're small and they don't really reach a lot of people. So when we look at the large pair, like if I walked into a public space and I was like, anybody ever heard of MRAs? Most people are they're gonna throw their hands up. They don't know what the hell that is.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So even when I've talked to people about it, which I don't go around doing all the time, but sometimes it comes up. They never even thought that was a conversation that they would have even thought to have. It's like a question you never thought to ask. So,
but have you ever wondered why it's been difficult for the men's rights movement to get a foothold outside of the internet?
I think it's because it's first off, it's really small. Secondly, we have a cultural attitude. We have a cultural attitude where we've always believed that the way things work is that men rule the world. So the idea that a man can actually have problems that they could suffer is alien to us. And so when someone says, well, look, men are being treated unfairly in these areas, they get their prison sentences are more harsh. There are fathers that are not getting child custody. There are men that are, even though women attempt suicide more often, men succeed more often. And these are not to take away, they're not intended to take away at all from any of women's problems. They're just saying, did you guys know that these problems even existed? And people are like, no, that can't be. Or, you know, they're flat.
Can I get in here for a second?
Well,
Yeah.
I would like to answer this. Well, actually, Kevin, go ahead. You're our guest.
Well, I was just going to briefly interject and suggest that's why I consider myself, one of the reasons I consider myself a feminist, and why I think feminism actually helps men. Because I think by breaking down what has been the historic gender stereotypes of men being essentially stern, emotionless, or the only emotion you're allowed to show is anger, by allowing men, as we discussed earlier, Alison, allowing men an opportunity to say, look, I am in trouble, or I have a problem, or X, Y, or Z, I think would actually really help men in general as well.
That's
Okay,
The MRA,
like
I
to-
find, actually perpetuate that.
Well, I'd like to address that, because I think feminism actually perpetuates the most important negative stereotype about men, and that is that they have more power than women. Because that's really the reason what delegitimizes the vulnerability of men. And I'm going to explain why. It's called moral typecasting. When we see a group of people as having power, we don't see their vulnerability. We don't really care as much about their vulnerability. That we put them in the role of agent, and we put women in the role of patient. And we may respect men for their abilities more than women, but we see women's needs more than men. And that's exactly the gender dynamic that I want to break down. And I just wanted to speak to what, oh goodness, I think I've lost my train of thought. Brian, help me out here.
I don't know what you were going to say, but I mean, that's what I'm saying. And so, like, when it comes to the gender discussion in this larger zeitgeist, and we see it happen in our mainstream media, where millions upon millions of people tune in. What lobbyists, what ideology dominates that conversation? It's the feminist one, right?
Well, it's not just the feminist one. It's the female victim one. The
Yeah.
females need shit. They need shit. Give it to them.
And
No, I would argue the
hold on.
curbs that are being placed on abortion actually would suggest that the situation you've described there is not actually in power at all.
Okay, but here's the thing. There are just as many women. In fact, I think until about 5 years ago, there was more women against abortion than there were men. And the other thing is that men don't have commensurate ability to walk away from parenthood as women. If men were brought into the fold and said, okay, well, you should have the same choices as women in terms of consensual parenthood, I think that the pro-choice position would become more powerful. Now, having said that, I don't want to get into the abortion debate because that is something that will take hours. But I wanted to say before we go, thank you, Kevin, for coming on. It does take a lot of bravery to actually listen and go into a space like this and be open to considering the possibilities.
Thank you for having me on.
Yeah.
I always enjoy a discussion. Dialectics sharpens your own brain as well as everyone else's.
Yeah, and you're welcome to come back if you wish.
Yeah, absolutely. Any time,
I'd love to actually cover some of the stuff that we didn't get covered here, which would be a discussion of patriarchy theory and even more of rape culture and our various viewpoints on these issues.
We can do that another time, yeah.
Yeah, sure.
It'd be great if these kinds of conversations were happening in like the larger sphere.
Yeah, larger
sphere.
sphere.
Generally don't. Yeah. So they got to start somewhere, and I think this is as good a place as any.
Yeah, I think we should.
Absolutely.
I think we should call it a day though today.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, everybody. I'm sorry if I didn't get to all the questions. We just had to cut it short. But we will let you know if we do another one of these kinds of conversations.
Why don't we just, Kevin? Would you like to come back next Friday?
Yes, absolutely.
All right, let's do it. There you go.
Okay.
We'll try to answer more questions then.
All right. Well, thank you. We'll see you next Friday, and we'll see you guys very soon.
Yeah.